What do you do when your girlfriend returns from a girls' weekend wearing an engagement ring, says, "We need to talk," and you realize the only honest move is to pack her entire life into boxes before her new fiancé learns she lived with you? My name is Ethan Rowe, and I used to believe that sharing a key and a grocery list meant you were building something real together, even if the person you lived with smiled like commitment was a costume she could take off whenever it stopped matching her mood. I was 32, steady in a way that people call boring when they want chaos, and I worked as an operations lead for a mid-sized logistics company where the math always adds up, the timelines always have consequences, and excuses do not magically become truth because you repeat them with conviction. The apartment was mine first, a clean second-floor unit above a quiet courtyard, and when Lila moved in, she did it the way she did everything, with momentum and charm and a set of assumptions that I would adjust myself around her preferences without realizing I was shrinking. Lila was 29, bright and magnetic in public, and in private she was a soft storm, the kind that starts as mist and ends as flooding, so you only notice the damage when your floors start warping. She loved the idea of us more than she loved being accountable to it, and for a long time I let that slide because I told myself everyone has quirks, everyone has stress, and everyone deserves patience when they are trying. She framed herself as the woman who just needed stability, and I framed myself as the man who could provide it. And that was the first quiet lie we told each other, because stability was never what she wanted when she could have attention instead. We had the kind of routines that look good from the outside, the kind your friends point to when they say you're lucky, because our weekends had brunch spots, shared errands, and lazy Sunday movies that made our living room feel like a small, safe world. I paid the rent, she covered utilities, and we split groceries in a way that felt fair enough to stop thinking about, which is exactly how people end up ignoring patterns that are trying to introduce themselves. Her phone would light up late at night, and she would tilt the screen away with a practiced angle that was too smooth to be innocent, and if I asked, she would laugh and tell me I was paranoid, then kiss my cheek like affection could erase the question. When she stayed out a little longer after work, the story was always rounded off, always polished, always delivered with just enough detail to sound believable, and just vague enough to leave no edges to grip. I am not a jealous man, and I never wanted to be the kind of boyfriend who audits someone's freedom. But the difference between trust and denial is whether you are willing to notice what is right in front of you. Lila started using phrases that sounded like she borrowed them from someone else, like a script she kept in her pocket for moments when the truth was inconvenient, and she used the same lines with different expressions as if that made them new. She began talking about alignment and energy and knowing her worth, which would have been fine if those words weren't always followed by requests that benefited her and responsibilities that fell on me. If I pushed back, she didn't argue on facts. She argued on feelings, and she made my calm sound like cruelty. 2 weeks before the girls' weekend, she floated the idea over dinner like it was a treat she deserved for surviving her own life, and she said it with a smile that asked for permission without respecting the possibility of no. She told me it would be just her and 2 friends from college, a cabin, some wine, and the kind of reset women need when men and work drain them, and I nodded because I had no reason at the time to treat it like anything other than what she said. She added that her phone might be spotty, and she said it in a joking tone, but the line landed like a little warning, like she was setting the stage early so I would not question the silence later. I watched her pack the night before, folding outfits that looked less like cabin clothes and more like she was dressing for photos, and when I teased her about it, she said she wanted to feel pretty for herself, which sounded healthy until you remembered how rarely she cared about being pretty when it was just me. The morning she left, she kissed me quickly, grabbed her duffel, and walked out with the same energy she used when she was bored of a room and wanted a better one. I stood at the window and watched her get into a rideshare, and as the car pulled away, I had the strange sense of being left behind in my own home, like my life was a waiting room where I was expected to sit quietly until she decided what happened next. I went back to my coffee, told myself I was being dramatic, and tried to enjoy the quiet, because sometimes quiet is a gift when you have lived with someone who fills every corner with their mood. That weekend was calmer than I expected, and the calm itself started to feel suspicious because Lila usually reached out when she wanted attention, even when she claimed she was busy. The first day I got one picture of a lake and a short message about recharging, and then the communication thinned into emojis and delayed replies that felt like they were being sent to satisfy an obligation rather than a desire. On Saturday night, I saw a social media story from one of her friends, a wide shot of a bar interior with neon signs and loud smiles, and it did not look like a cabin, and it did not look like a quiet reset. I stared at it longer than I should have, then told myself it was probably a stop on the way, or maybe a different place entirely, and I hated how easily my mind tried to patch the hole because it was afraid of what would happen if I stopped patching. By Sunday afternoon, I was restless in my own apartment, walking from room to room, noticing details that had become invisible, like her makeup scattered across the bathroom counter, her hair ties on the nightstand, her shoes lined up in the entryway like she planned to return and step right back into the life she had been coasting in. I opened the fridge and saw her favorite drinks, and I realized I had stocked them like a man preparing for a future that might already be canceled without his knowledge. That night, I slept badly, waking up to the glow of my own phone out of habit, as if I was training myself to accept whatever delay she offered me. She came back on Monday evening, later than she said she would, dragging her duffel across the floor with a tired sigh that sounded rehearsed. The moment I saw her hand, I felt the air change, because there was a ring on her finger that was too bright, too new, and too deliberate to be an accident or a joke. It was an engagement ring, the kind you do not wear unless you want it seen, and for a second I thought maybe she was playing some weird prank, something childish and cruel that she would laugh off after filming my reaction. Then I saw her face, the way she held her mouth like she was bracing for impact, and I realized this was not a prank, because she was not amused, she was calculating. She set the bag down, looked at me like I was the last obstacle between her and a new story, and said we needed to talk, which is what people say when they want to control the timing of your pain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask who. I didn't demand an explanation, because something in me clicked into place with a cold clarity that felt almost relieving. I had been waiting for the truth to stop circling and finally land, and now it was sitting right on her hand, sparkling like it deserved applause. No need, I told her, and the words came out flat because my body refused to feed her the drama she expected. I watched her blink, watched confusion ripple across her expression, as if she had practiced a speech, and now the audience had left. She tried to speak anyway, because control is an addiction, and she started with a story about how the weekend got complicated, how someone had realized what they wanted, how she had been thinking for a long time, and I held up my hand, not as a threat, but as a boundary that should have existed months earlier. I told her that I did not need the performance, and that whatever she was about to say was for her conscience, not for my understanding, because I already understood the only part that mattered, which was that she had made a decision while living in my space, eating my food, sleeping in my bed, and still expected to stand in front of me as if she had moral authority. Her face tightened, and she tried to pivot into offense, because if she could make me the villain, she could leave without guilt. She said she didn't plan it. She said it happened fast. She said she didn't want to hurt me, and I felt the absurdity of those lines like a low, bitter laugh in my chest. People who do not want to hurt you do not come home wearing evidence of betrayal, and people who respect you do not treat your life like a temporary hotel while they shop for a better deal. I told her we were done, and I said it like a fact, not a threat, because threats invite negotiation, and I was done negotiating my dignity. She stared at me, then looked around the apartment like she was suddenly noticing that the walls belonged to someone else, and that her comfort here had always been borrowed. She asked where she was supposed to go, as if she had not already accepted a proposal from another man, as if her future had not been arranged over my head. I told her she could go to her parents, the same place she planned to go to share her news, and the phrase landed hard because she realized I knew exactly what she was about to do, and that I was refusing to play the part of the clueless ex-boyfriend in her new engagement story. She argued for a while, but her arguments were messy because she didn't have a clean angle that made her look good, and when she couldn't get sympathy, she tried to get anger out of me. She said I was cold. She said I didn't fight for her. She said maybe this was why she had to find someone else. And I listened without reacting because nothing about her accusations could compete with the ring on her finger. Eventually, she retreated into the bedroom and closed the door, and I stood in the living room with a strange calm, the kind that comes when the decision you were afraid to make gets made for you in the most unforgivable way. That night, while she showered and pretended the apartment was still hers for a few more hours, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a notepad, and I wrote a list like it was a work problem because my brain understands lists when my heart is trying to drown. I listed what belonged to her, what documents were in our shared spaces, what subscriptions had her name on them, what accounts needed to be separated, and what timeline made the most sense if I wanted her out, without giving her days to turn it into a drama campaign. I checked the lease, confirmed that my name was the primary, confirmed that she was never added as a tenant, and the relief I felt was sharp enough to taste, because legality and clarity are the only comforts that betrayal cannot steal. By morning, she was dressed and ready to leave for her parents' place, acting like the apartment was a neutral zone, acting like what she did was just a change in plans, not a demolition of trust. She told me she would be back later to get her things, and the way she said it carried a quiet assumption that I would wait, that I would keep her belongings safe, that I would treat her with the respect she refused to give me. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I had already decided that the version of me who kept making space for her was not coming back. As soon as the door closed behind her, I stood there listening to the silence settle, and I realized it did not feel lonely. It felt clean. I opened the windows, let cold air move through the rooms, and I started taking inventory with a calm that felt almost surgical. Her shoes went into boxes. Her clothes came off hangers. Her cosmetics were sealed carefully, and I did it with the same care you use when you want no one to accuse you of sabotage. Because I was not trying to destroy her belongings, I was trying to remove her footprint from my life. I called a local moving service, booked the earliest slot, and paid for it in full, because I did not want delays and I did not want negotiations, and I especially did not want to watch her carry a single box while performing sadness she did not earn. By late afternoon, the apartment looked different, like a set after the actor leaves, because every item that had been hers was now packed and stacked by the door, labeled neatly, ready to go. I wrote a short message telling her the movers would drop everything at her parents' house and that she would not need to come back, and I stared at my phone for a moment before sending it, because I knew what it would do. It would remove her stage. It would remove her chance to cry in my hallway. It would remove her ability to stall while she crafted a story, and it would force her to explain to her parents why her entire life arrived in boxes the same day she brought them an engagement ring. I pressed send, and as the notification whooshed away, I realized the real confrontation was not going to be with Lila at all, because the ring meant there was a man on the other side of her story, and sooner or later, he was going to learn that her fresh start had been built on my couch, my rent, and my patience. The movers arrived right on time, 2 men in work boots who didn't ask personal questions because they had seen every version of other people's mess, and I appreciated that more than they could have guessed. I walked them through the apartment, pointed at the stacked boxes, and watched their eyes flick over the labels like they were reading the outline of a life that had been abruptly rewritten. They carried everything down the stairs with practiced efficiency, and every thud of cardboard against the truck bed sounded like a door closing, which was exactly what I needed. I signed the delivery form, gave them the address Lila had listed as her parents' place, and added a small tip because I wanted the job done cleanly, without delays, without arguments, and without any excuse for her to come back pretending she needed something. When the truck pulled away, I stood in the courtyard and felt the strange sensation of having reclaimed my own space, like the air around my chest had more room to move. I went back upstairs and looked at the apartment the way you look at a place after guests leave, noticing the quiet, the blank corners, the absence of clutter that had slowly become normal. There were still traces of her, of course, because you don't erase someone in one afternoon, but the loudest parts were gone, and that mattered. I took a trash bag and started collecting the little leftovers she had scattered like ownership: a hair clip under the couch, a pair of earrings in the bathroom drawer, a half-used candle that smelled like the perfume she wore when she wanted to be forgiven. I wasn't sentimental about it, but I wasn't careless either, because I had no interest in giving her a single reason to claim I had stolen or destroyed anything, not when she already had the kind of personality that could turn inconvenience into an accusation if it suited her narrative. She called me about an hour after the movers left, and the ringtone felt almost invasive in the new quiet, like a loud voice at a funeral. I answered without greeting her, because politeness would have been a lie. She didn't start with anger, which surprised me, because Lila usually reached for fury like it was a tool, but instead, she began with that careful tone she used when she was about to manipulate someone into thinking they were having a reasonable conversation. She asked what I had done, as if she hadn't received my message, as if the idea of consequences was still foreign to her. I told her everything of hers was on the way to her parents, and I said it plainly, like I was confirming a delivery window, not ending a shared life. Her voice sharpened, and then the anger arrived right on schedule, because she needed it to feel powerful. She accused me of humiliating her, of overreacting, of being petty, and the irony was so clean it almost made me laugh. She said she was going to come back and talk like an adult, and I told her there was nothing to talk about, because the ring had done all the talking necessary. She shifted tactics, bringing up how long we had been together, how much she had invested, how I was throwing away something that could have been fixed, and I listened long enough to hear the real fear beneath her words. She wasn't afraid of losing me as a person. She was afraid of losing the stability of my apartment as a staging area while she stepped into her new engagement without any discomfort. I told her I wasn't her storage unit, and I wasn't her transition plan, and then I ended the call because there was no version of that conversation that ended with her accepting responsibility. A minute later, she texted me a paragraph full of accusations, and I didn't respond, because responding would have been participation. She followed up with another message that swung toward sadness, then another that hinted at threats, and I still didn't respond. Silence is a strange weapon, because it gives the other person nothing to grip, and it forces them to face their own noise. Around early evening, I got a call from an unknown number, and I answered out of habit, expecting a work issue. But instead, I heard a man's voice that was tense and confused, like he had walked into a room and realized the script had changed. He introduced himself as Grant, and he didn't say his last name at first, which told me he was trying to keep control over how much of himself he revealed. He asked if I knew Lila, and I felt my mouth go dry for a second. Not from fear, but from the grim satisfaction of knowing the collision was finally happening. I told him yes, and I kept my voice flat, because I wasn't interested in sounding emotional for his benefit. There was a pause on the line, the kind that means someone is staring at a scene they didn't expect, and then he asked me, carefully, how I knew her. The question was almost polite, but beneath it was the panic of a man realizing he might be building his future on a foundation made of lies. I told him she had been living with me in my apartment until this morning, and I let the words sit there for a beat so he could absorb them without me adding any drama. He didn't speak for a moment, and I could practically hear his brain trying to calculate, trying to force reality into a shape that didn't embarrass him. Then he asked if I was sure, as if I might be mistaken about the woman who had slept in my bed. I told him I was sure, and I added that her belongings were currently being delivered to her parents' house, which was probably where she was right now, explaining her engagement the way she wanted it to be understood. He swore under his breath, and the sound was sharp and involuntary, like a reflex. He asked how long, and I told him I wasn't keeping a diary of her choices, but she had been living with me for months, and she had been acting like we were together up until the moment she walked in wearing his ring. Grant's voice turned tight, and he asked what I wanted, because men like him assume every conversation is a negotiation. I told him I didn't want anything from him, not money, not an apology, not a fight, because I wasn't competing for a woman who could live a double life without flinching. I said I was answering because he asked, and because I had no reason to protect her story. I didn't insult her, and I didn't flatter him, because my goal wasn't revenge in the messy sense, it was clarity. If he wanted to marry her, he deserved to know what kind of person he was marrying, and if she wanted to play clean, she shouldn't have come home wearing evidence of betrayal. He asked if I had proof, and that question landed like a spotlight because it revealed his priorities. He wasn't asking if she had hurt me, he was asking if he could defend himself against looking like a fool. I told him he didn't need my proof, because the proof was literally moving into her parents' living room right now in labeled boxes. But if he insisted on something tangible, he could ask her why she had a key to my apartment, why her mail still came here, and why she had an entire wardrobe that had been hanging in my closet yesterday. I heard him exhale, and it sounded like a man trying not to break something in his hands. He said he was at her parents' house, and that he had just arrived, and the detail made my stomach tighten, because it meant the confrontation was happening in real time, right now, with her family as an audience. I pictured Lila in her childhood living room, ring on her finger, face arranged into whatever expression she thought would control the room, and I pictured Grant standing there with his own expectations crumbling. He asked me again, quieter now, if she had been living with me while she was with him, and I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know when their relationship officially began, but I knew she was in my apartment, in my bed, and calling me her boyfriend until she came back engaged. That was enough to answer the question he didn't want to ask out loud. The line went silent for a second. Then I heard movement, voices in the background, and a woman saying something sharp, like a mother demanding an explanation. Grant didn't hang up, but his breathing changed, and he told me, with forced calm, that he needed to ask one more thing. He asked if I had spoken to her about him before, if she had mentioned him, if I had known there was someone else. I told him she had never mentioned a fiancé, never hinted at an engagement, never used the word us in a way that included anyone but me. And then I said something I hadn't planned but felt true as soon as it left my mouth. I told him that Lila's most consistent relationship was with her own advantage, and that everyone else was temporary. He didn't respond to that, because it wasn't a fact he could argue. It was a warning he could only accept or ignore. I heard him step away from the background noise, and he asked me if I would be willing to text him a simple statement confirming she lived with me, just a sentence with my name, because he said he didn't want this to become a he said, she said situation. I considered it for a moment, and I realized the request wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting himself from being gaslit into doubting what he was seeing. I told him I would send a short message, and I asked him for a number to send it to. After we ended the call, I typed one sentence, clean and factual, no emotion, no insults, just the truth with a date. I wrote that Lila had been living with me at my apartment address until today, and that I had arranged delivery of her belongings to her parents' house that afternoon. I included my full name, because the power of a lie collapses when you attach your identity to reality. I sent it, and then I put my phone down and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wood grain like it might offer a map out of the mess. Minutes later, I got a string of messages from Lila, and the tone had changed completely, because now she wasn't dealing with me, she was dealing with the collapse of her polished story in front of the one audience she couldn't easily replace. She demanded to know what I had said, she accused me of ruining her life, she called me vindictive, and then, in a sudden pivot, she begged me to fix it. That shift, from fury to pleading, told me everything I needed to know about what mattered to her. It wasn't love, it wasn't loyalty, it wasn't even the engagement itself, it was her image, and the ring was just a prop in the performance of being chosen. I didn't reply to her because I had already given her the only response she deserved, and because Grant now knew enough to make his own decision. I stood up, walked through the apartment again, and for the first time in a long time, the space felt like mine without apology. Outside, the sky had turned dark, and the courtyard lights flickered on, and I realized that whatever storm was happening at her parents' house was not my storm anymore. I had been pulled into her chaos for too long, and now the chaos had finally turned back toward the person who created it, and I was done standing in the splash zone. Later that night, my phone rang again, and it was Grant, but this time his voice sounded different, sharper, more controlled, like a man who had just watched someone try to rewrite reality in real time and had decided he would not be the victim of it. He told me the movers had arrived, and that Lila's parents were stunned, and that Lila was denying everything with a straight face that would have been impressive if it wasn't disgusting. He told me she claimed she had only been staying with me temporarily, that we were basically roommates, and that I was angry because she had moved on, and I felt my jaw tighten, not because her lie hurt me, but because it was so predictable it was almost boring. I told Grant that if she was claiming roommate status, he should ask her why she kept her clothes in my closet, why she kept her toiletries in my bathroom, why she had keys, and why she didn't tell him about any of it before accepting his ring. He made a low sound like agreement, and then he said something that confirmed the moment had shifted. He told me her parents had started asking questions, and she was slipping, contradicting herself, changing dates, and looking around the room like she wanted an exit. He paused, then said he had looked at the ring again, and he suddenly felt like it was heavy, like it wasn't a promise anymore, it was an accusation. I didn't offer comfort because I wasn't his therapist, but I did offer one clean piece of guidance. I told him not to let her turn this into a debate about feelings, because feelings are where she wins, and instead to keep it anchored in facts, because facts are where her performance falls apart. He thanked me, quietly, and then he ended the call, and I sat back in my chair with a calm that felt earned. Betrayal is loud, but truth is louder when you stop whispering it for the benefit of the liar. Grant did not call me again that night, which I took as a sign that the situation had escalated beyond the point where an extra witness on the phone mattered. I went to bed late, not because I was tortured by heartbreak, but because my mind kept replaying the same sequence of moments like a security camera loop, trying to identify the exact second when I should have seen the split in Lila's story. The quiet in the apartment felt honest, and that honesty was unfamiliar, because for months I had been living inside a version of reality that depended on me not asking the wrong questions. When I finally slept, it was the kind of sleep you fall into after a long shift, heavy and blank, with no dreams worth remembering. In the morning, I woke up to sunlight and the notification glow on my phone, a cluster of missed calls and messages that looked like a storm front on a radar screen. Most were from Lila, and I didn't open them at first because I knew what they would contain, a rotating mix of rage, bargaining, and self-pity, none of it anchored in responsibility. One was from an unknown number again, and I assumed it might be Grant, but when I listened to the voicemail, it was a woman, older, controlled, her words clipped with the kind of authority that comes from years of being obeyed. She introduced herself as Lila's mother, and she asked me to call her back because they needed to clear some things up. The phrase sounded polite, but the implication was obvious. They wanted to negotiate reality back into a shape that embarrassed them less. I made coffee and stood by the window while it brewed, watching people cross the courtyard with backpacks and dog leashes, ordinary lives moving forward as if betrayal didn't exist. I called her mother back because I wanted to close the loop, and because I didn't like leaving loose ends, especially when someone else was trying to tie them into a noose around my neck. She answered on the second ring as if she had been waiting with the phone in her hand, and I could hear the muted sound of a television in the background, some morning show chirping about weather and recipes while her family imploded. She asked me, in that careful tone, to explain what I meant when I told Grant that Lila had been living with me. I told her exactly what it meant, that Lila had keys, clothes, mail, routines, and a space in my life that wasn't temporary, no matter what version she was selling now. Her mother tried to soften it, suggesting that Lila had told them she and I were on a break, and that I was reacting out of jealousy, and I felt a cold amusement because it was such a clean example of how lies get packaged for different audiences. When Lila wanted to keep me calm, she acted committed. When she wanted to keep her parents calm, she acted independent. When she wanted to keep Grant calm, she acted faithful. 3 versions of the same woman, none of them real. I told her mother I wasn't going to debate terminology, because whether you call it living together or staying over, the fact remained that Lila had built a relationship with me while she was building another one somewhere else. Her mother's voice tightened, and she said Grant was very upset, as if that was the main tragedy. She said their family did not want drama, and I almost laughed because the word drama is what people use when they want you to shut up about the truth. I told her the only person who created the situation was her daughter, and that I had no interest in participating in any cleanup operation designed to preserve Lila's image. There was a brief silence, and then her mother asked me what I wanted, and that question revealed the heart of it. They assumed I was doing this for leverage, for money, for revenge, for attention, because that is how they understood conflict, as a transaction. I told her I wanted nothing, and I meant it. I told her the apartment was no longer Lila's base, and my life was no longer her backup plan. I said the truth had already been said, and it was up to them to deal with it. She tried to press, implying that I should consider how this could ruin Lila's future, and I felt my patience thin because the focus remained on the consequences for Lila, never on the choices that caused them. I told her mother something I hoped she would repeat to her daughter, even if she pretended not to hear it. I told her that if Lila's future could be ruined by the truth, then the future she was building was already rotten. Her mother ended the call quickly after that, not with a goodbye, but with the kind of clipped dismissal that people use when they realize they can't control you. I set my phone down and felt a strange calm, because the moment I refused to be managed, the whole machinery of their narrative stopped working. An hour later, Grant texted me, not with questions, but with a short update that read like a man trying to keep himself from exploding. He told me he had left Lila at her parents' house and driven home alone, and that she had been calling him non-stop since sunrise. He said she was now claiming she didn't know how to tell him about me because she was afraid, which was almost impressive in its audacity. He asked me, finally, what I knew about the timeline, whether she had ever mentioned his name, whether there were signs I had ignored. I stared at the message for a moment, because it wasn't really a request for information. It was a request for reassurance that he wasn't stupid. I texted him back honestly, because honesty was the only clean thing left in this situation. I told him Lila never mentioned a fiancé, never mentioned a boyfriend, never mentioned anything that would imply she was dividing her life. I told him there were small inconsistencies, late nights, vague excuses, moments where her story seemed too smooth, but nothing that screamed engagement ring, because she would never have risked that in front of me. I said she was careful, and that care was what made it worse, because it meant she wasn't confused or reckless. She was deliberate. Grant asked if I would meet him, and the request surprised me, because men like him usually handle humiliation privately, like an injury they don't want anyone to see. He said he didn't want to talk on the phone anymore because he needed to look someone in the eye and hear the truth without distortion. I hesitated for a few seconds, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to be pulled back into Lila's orbit through someone else's pain. Then I realized that closure isn't always a private thing, and that sometimes the cleanest way to end a story is to let the other character see the real ending, not the edited version. We met at a quiet cafe a few blocks from my building, a place with small tables and the kind of background music that tries too hard to sound calm. Grant arrived early, sitting rigidly in a corner like he was waiting for an appointment he didn't want. He stood when he saw me, and his handshake was firm but slightly delayed, as if his body was trying to perform confidence while his mind was still catching up. He looked like someone who had slept badly, eyes tired, jaw clenched, but he also looked like someone who had spent the morning replaying every conversation he had ever had with Lila, searching for the exact moment she lied. We ordered coffee, and we sat. And for a moment, neither of us spoke because there is a strange etiquette in shared humiliation. Grant broke the silence first, asking me how long I had been with Lila. I told him the rough span, months, long enough for routines to form, long enough for her to feel comfortable leaving things around my apartment like she owned the space. He asked if she had a key, and I said yes, because she insisted on it early, framing it as trust, and I realized now it was convenience. He asked if she had talked about the future with me, and I said yes, because she had done that too, not in concrete plans, but in vague promises that kept me invested without requiring her to commit to anything measurable. Then Grant took out his phone, not to show me messages, but to steady his hands, and he asked the question that had probably been burning since last night. He asked if I thought she loved him, and I looked at him for a long moment because it was the saddest possible question in the middle of a mess built from selfishness. I told him I didn't know what she felt, but I knew what she did, and what she did was make sure she always had options. I told him that love doesn't require a second apartment, and it doesn't come home with a ring while pretending nothing has changed. He nodded slowly, like he was accepting a diagnosis he had already suspected. Then he asked if I would describe her living situation honestly, because she was now telling him she had been crashing at my place after arguments with her parents, and that I had misunderstood. The lie was almost funny in its desperation. I told him she had been living with me like a partner, not visiting, not crashing, not borrowing space temporarily. I told him she had a drawer in the bathroom, her skincare bottles lined up like a schedule, and she had a favorite mug she used every morning like a ritual. I told him those details mattered because they were the difference between a casual overlap and a calculated double life. Grant's face tightened at that, and he stared down at the table as if the wood grain might offer him a distraction from the humiliation rising in his throat. He asked me if I had ever met her parents, and I said no, and that seemed to hit him hard, because he probably realized she had kept her world separate, not because it was complicated, but because it was strategic. He asked if she had ever posted anything about me, and I said no, not publicly, only private photos, the kind she could delete without anyone noticing. I could see him connecting the dots, understanding that her online life had been curated like a showroom, showing only what made her look desirable and unburdened. Then he told me what happened at her parents' house, and I listened without interrupting because he needed to say it out loud. He said she had introduced him to her parents as if everything was normal, smiling too widely, ring held up like a trophy. He said her parents were happy, proud, relieved, like they thought she had finally settled. Then the movers arrived, and the first box came through the door with my address printed on the label, and the room shifted in a way he could physically feel. He said Lila's smile froze, and then she tried to laugh it off, and when that failed, she turned toward anger. And when anger failed, she went straight into tears, not grief, but performance. He told me she tried to claim I was obsessed, that I couldn't let her go, that I was doing this to sabotage her engagement, and he said the worst part wasn't that she lied. It was that she lied with confidence, like she believed the room would choose her version because it was more convenient. Grant said her father had started looking at the boxes like they were evidence in a trial, reading the labels, asking questions, and Lila kept changing her answers. At one point, Grant said, she tried to frame it as a misunderstanding about boundaries, as if boundaries were the reason she had been living with another man while accepting his ring. I sat there and felt something close to relief, not because I wanted Lila to suffer, but because the truth had finally gained witnesses, and witnesses make lies harder to recycle. Grant looked up at me then, eyes hard, and he said he was done, but he wanted one last thing before he ended it. He said he wanted Lila to admit, out loud, that she had been living with me, because he didn't want the story to evolve into a version where he was the villain and she was the victim. He asked me if I would be willing to be on speakerphone when he confronted her, just long enough to confirm the facts, and then he would never contact me again. I thought about it, and I realized that what he was asking for wasn't revenge. It was closure, a simple anchor point that would stop her from rewriting the narrative later. I told him yes, but only if he kept it short and factual, because I had no interest in being dragged into a theatrical argument. He nodded, and for the first time since we sat down, his posture eased slightly, as if having another person confirm reality gave him back a fraction of his control. We finished our coffee in silence, and the silence was no longer awkward. It was practical. Grant stood, thanked me again, and then said something that surprised me with its blunt clarity. He said he couldn't believe she had been able to look at him with that ring on her finger while she still had her life at my place, and he said he felt like he had been invited into a story where the ending had already been written, and he just hadn't been told. I didn't disagree, because disagreement would have been dishonest. After he left, I walked back to my apartment and noticed the city in a new way, not because the buildings had changed, but because my role in the story had changed. I wasn't the confused boyfriend anymore, and I wasn't the angry ex either. I was the person who had refused to bargain with a lie. When I got home, I saw that Lila had sent another message, shorter this time, sharper, a line that accused me of ruining everything. I stared at it and felt almost nothing, because she was right in one narrow sense. I had ruined the version of reality where she got to keep everyone, and I considered that a public service. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was Grant, a single text that read like a decision. He said he was going to her parents' house now, and he would call once, and then it would be over. I set my phone on the counter, washed my mug, and waited, because there are moments when you can feel the story tightening toward its final turn, and you don't need to rush it. You just need to be ready when it lands. Grant called me from his car, and I could hear the turn signal clicking like a metronome keeping time with his anger. He did not sound dramatic anymore, which was almost worse, because he sounded focused, like a man who had decided the only way to survive humiliation was to turn it into something clean and final. He told me he was 10 minutes away from her parents' house, and he asked me again if I would confirm one simple fact if she tried to twist it. I told him I would not argue with her, I would not react to her insults, and I would not let her drag me into a performance, but I would confirm what I knew, and then I would hang up. He said that was all he needed, and he ended the call without a goodbye, like he was conserving emotion for the next collision. I sat on the edge of my couch and stared at the blank television screen, watching my own reflection in it like it belonged to someone else. I kept thinking about how quickly the meaning of a person changes once the mask is gone, because yesterday Lila was the woman who had left for a trip and returned with a ring, and today she was a problem moving through rooms, leaving damage behind her like smoke. I did not feel grief, at least not in the sentimental way people expect. I felt the hard exhaustion of having been used as a staging area for someone else's fantasy, and I felt a cold satisfaction that the fantasy had finally met the friction of reality. When my phone rang again, I answered on the first ring, and Grant's voice came through tight and low. He said he was in their driveway, and he could see her car parked beside his, as if she still believed the world would politely make room for her contradictions. He said her father was on the porch, arms crossed, and her mother was pacing behind him in the doorway, like a referee trying to decide which rules applied now. Grant told me he was putting me on speaker, and then he walked inside, and I heard the shift in acoustics as the sound of the car disappeared and the sound of a house took over, quiet and tense, the way houses sound right before they become arenas. Lila's voice hit first, sharp and theatrical, and I could picture her without seeing her because I had seen that tone before when she wanted to control a room. She demanded to know why Grant was doing this, and she said she had already explained everything, and the words were so familiar they almost bored me. Then her mother's voice cut in, urging calm, and her father said something I could not fully make out, but the cadence was the cadence of a man who had reached the end of patience. Grant did not raise his voice, which made everyone else sound worse by comparison, and he asked her a question that was almost insultingly simple. He asked her if she had been living with me. There was a pause, and in that pause I could hear everything she was calculating, the angles, the exits, the version of the story that gave her the least immediate pain. Then she laughed, a brittle laugh that did not match the moment, and she said something about how I was obsessed, and how I was trying to ruin her life because I could not accept that she had chosen someone else. Grant asked again, using the same calm tone, and that was when she snapped. She accused him of being controlling, of making her feel unsafe, of forcing her into secrecy, and I felt my jaw tighten, not because I cared what she said about me, but because I recognized the shape of the tactic. When a liar runs out of plausible facts, they start building a moral accusation because morality is harder to disprove in real time. Grant said my name, clearly, and then he said he had me on the phone. He told her he did not want a speech, he wanted a yes or no, and he asked the question a third time. Lila's voice changed instantly when she realized I could hear her, softening at the edges, trying to regain the image of the reasonable woman trapped between two unreasonable men. She said she and I had been seeing each other, but she insisted it was not serious, and she claimed she had been staying with me only because she needed space, and she said I had misunderstood the arrangement. She tried to make it sound like a casual overlap, like a mistake in communication, like a mild social inconvenience. I spoke only once, and I made sure my voice stayed flat, because flat voices are harder to manipulate. I said she had keys to my apartment, she had mail delivered there, she kept her clothes there, and she stayed there most nights for months. I said she was not crashing, she was living there, and I said it without anger, because anger would have made it a debate. The room went quiet for a beat, and then Lila exploded, screaming that I was lying, that I was making things up, and that I was a jealous man who could not let her go. Her mother tried to hush her, and her father said her name in a way that sounded like disappointment, not protection, and I realized that in that moment Lila was losing something she could not replace with a new story. Grant asked her why she had come back from a girls' weekend, wearing an engagement ring if she was still living with me. Lila tried to pivot again, saying the weekend was complicated, saying she had been pressured, saying she had not wanted to hurt anyone. She kept circling the same false center, the idea that she was a good person, trapped by circumstance, when the truth was simpler. She wanted what she wanted, and she thought she could take it without paying for it, because she had been paying with other people's dignity, not her own. Grant told her he had seen the moving boxes, he had read my address on them, and he had heard my voice confirm it. He said there was nothing left to discuss. Then he said something that made me sit up straighter, because it was the first genuinely strategic thing I heard from him. He said he wanted the ring back, and he wanted it back today, because he was not going to let her keep it as a souvenir of a lie she told at his expense. Lila protested, and her mother jumped in, suggesting they could handle this privately, and I almost smiled, because people always want privacy when the truth starts leaving fingerprints. Grant said no, and he repeated that he wanted the ring back now. Her father spoke then, his voice lower, heavy with finality, and he told Lila to give the ring back. The authority in that sentence was different from Grant's, and it landed differently, because it came from a man who had watched her grow up and still found himself disgusted. Lila started crying, real crying this time, not the performance tears, but the angry tears of someone realizing the room will not rescue her. I heard the small metallic sound of the ring hitting a hard surface, probably a table, and then Grant exhaled, slow and controlled, like a man letting go of something he had been gripping too tightly. He told her he would send her a message later about anything practical that remained, but he did not want her contacting him until then. Lila tried to speak again, her voice frantic, promising explanations, promising that she could fix it, and Grant cut her off with a single sentence that sounded almost gentle. He said some things are not fixed, they are ended. Then he told me he was hanging up, and he did. I stared at my phone for a moment after the call ended, as if it might ring again with a new catastrophe. It did not. The silence that followed felt clean, and that cleanliness was unsettling, because I had gotten used to being pulled into Lila's chaos the way you get used to bad weather. I walked into the bedroom and opened the closet, and the space where her clothes had been was already empty, but the emptiness itself felt like evidence. I looked at the imprint of her presence, the small dents in the carpet where her suitcase used to sit, the faint floral scent that still clung to the room like a lie refusing to leave. My phone buzzed a few minutes later with a text from Lila, and I did not open it immediately. I waited, because I did not want to give her the satisfaction of instant reaction. When I finally looked, it was exactly what I expected, a message that tried to punish me for refusing her control. She called me petty. She called me cruel. She said she had trusted me. And then she ended with a threat that was written like a warning but meant as leverage. She said I had better be careful about what I told people, because she could tell her side too. I read it twice, not because it was profound, but because I wanted to memorize the tone, the way she shifted from victim to aggressor the moment sympathy was denied. I did not respond. Instead, I opened my notes app and wrote down a timeline in plain language, because the one thing I had learned from living with someone like Lila was that the story always matters, and the person who keeps the story straight usually survives. I wrote the date she left for the trip, the date she returned with the ring, the date she told me they needed to talk, the date I moved her belongings out, and the date Grant confronted her at her parents' house. I wrote it like a log, not because I planned to use it in court, but because I wanted my own memory to be anchored in facts, not in her emotions. That afternoon, I left the apartment for the first time since the moving trucks, and the air outside felt sharper, like winter was finally committing. I walked to a nearby store to buy a few things I did not need, simply to give my body a task while my mind processed the shift. As I walked, I caught myself scanning faces, half expecting to see Lila appear out of nowhere, because she had that habit of forcing confrontation on her terms. I did not see her, and I realized that she had lost her leverage the moment she lost access to my space. When I returned home, there was a small envelope under my door, white, unmarked, except for my name written in familiar handwriting. My stomach tightened, because handwriting is intimate in a way texts are not, and this was the kind of intimacy I did not want anymore. I carried it inside, placed it on the counter, and stared at it for a long minute before opening it. Inside was a spare key, one I had forgotten existed, and a short note that did not apologize, did not explain, and did not admit anything real. It said she hoped I would be mature about this, and it said she never meant to hurt anyone, and it said she would come by later to get the last few things she had left. The arrogance in that last line made my mouth go dry, because she still spoke as if she had rights here, as if my apartment was a storage unit for her convenience. I picked up the key, placed it in my palm, and felt the cool metal against my skin. Then I took the note and tore it slowly into strips, not in a rage, but in a deliberate act of closure. I threw the pieces into the trash, locked the door, and for the first time since she returned with that ring, I felt the situation simplify down to one clear truth. She could no longer enter my life without permission, and I had no reason to grant it. My phone buzzed again, this time from Grant, and the message was short, almost clinical. He said it was done, he had the ring, and he thanked me for confirming the facts. Then he added one last line that made my stomach shift, because it hinted at a different kind of chaos. He said Lila's parents asked him for my address, and he did not give it, but he wanted me to know they might try to contact me anyway. I looked at the locked door, the deadbolt, the chain, and I realized that this story was not finished with me yet, because people like Lila do not accept endings when they still think they can rewrite them. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm and lay there listening to my own apartment settle, the pipes ticking softly, the refrigerator humming like it was trying to pretend nothing had happened. I checked my phone out of habit, not because I wanted messages, but because I wanted to know what kind of day I was about to be forced into, and there were 3 missed calls from an unknown number, spaced out like someone pacing a hallway. I did not call back, because calling back is how you let people drag you into their script, and I had already learned that Lila's scripts always ended with someone else apologizing for her choices. When I stepped into the kitchen, I saw the spare key still sitting on the counter where I had left it, and the sight of it made me feel both safer and more exposed at the same time. It was proof that she had been here, even after everything, and it was also proof that she had been forced to surrender something she thought she owned. I made coffee slowly, using the routine like a shield, and while it brewed, I opened my notes app again and added a line. Unknown number called 3 times. No voicemail. I was not building a case, not officially, but I was building a spine for myself, because when the manipulation starts, memory becomes a battlefield. Around noon, there was a knock at my door, not the polite tap of a neighbor, but a firm, rhythmic knock that carried confidence, like whoever was outside expected to be let in. I did not open it immediately. I walked to the peephole, leaned in, and saw an older woman I recognized from pictures on Lila's phone, her mother, hair done neatly, coat buttoned, eyes sharp with the kind of determined concern that can turn into accusation without warning. Beside her was Lila's father, taller than I remembered, posture stiff, as if he had spent the entire night rehearsing a speech he did not want to give. I did not open the door. I spoke through it, keeping my voice low and even, because distance is power when emotions are trying to spill into your space. Her mother called my name like we were old friends, as if she had not been asking for my address yesterday. She said they just wanted to talk, that there had been misunderstandings, and that everyone was very upset. Her father did not speak at first, and that silence told me he was either there to keep her controlled or to make sure she did not back down. I told them I was not interested in a conversation at my door. Her mother said she understood, but she kept talking anyway, and she said Lila was in a fragile state, that she had made mistakes, and that I should not make this harder by refusing to communicate. The word fragile landed like a cheap trick, because fragile is what people call someone when they want you to feel responsible for the consequences of their behavior. I told her I had already moved Lila's belongings out, that she was no longer living with me, and that there was nothing to discuss. Her father finally spoke, and his voice was quieter than hers, but it carried weight. He said he did not come to defend what Lila did, and he did not come to threaten me, and he asked if I could at least confirm one thing for him, because he needed it for his own peace of mind. I said I would confirm facts, nothing else. He asked how long she had been living with me. I gave him a time range, not exact dates, but enough to make the situation impossible to minimize. Her mother inhaled sharply, like she had been clinging to a smaller version of the truth, and her face tightened with something that looked like grief and anger tangled together. Then her mother's tone shifted, and I felt it happen the way you feel the temperature change when a storm is about to break. She said Lila had told them she and I were seeing each other casually, and that I had gotten attached, and she said she needed to know whether I had pressured her, whether I had made promises, whether I had done something to trap her into staying. It was a test, a trap dressed as concern, and it was also a signal that Lila had already started crafting the narrative that would make her less guilty. I told her there was no pressure, no trapping, and no promises beyond what Lila claimed she wanted, which was stability, privacy, and time. Her father exhaled like he had been holding his breath for days. Her mother did not accept the answer. She asked if I knew about the engagement, and I told her I learned when Lila came back with a ring and said they needed to talk. Her mother's eyes narrowed, and she said Lila claimed she had planned to tell me earlier but had been afraid of my reaction. The audacity of that line almost made me laugh, because Lila was not afraid of reactions. She collected reactions the way some people collect trophies. I told her my reaction had been to remove her belongings and end the arrangement, and that was all. There was a pause on the other side of the door, and then her father said something that surprised me, not because it was kind, but because it was honest. He said he was sorry. He said he did not know what his daughter was thinking, and he did not know how she had learned to live in overlaps like this, but he knew it was wrong, and he said he appreciated that I had not tried to escalate it into something uglier. His wife turned toward him sharply, like she could not believe he was giving me any ground, and I heard the soft friction of their marriage behind the words. Her mother said they needed Lila's remaining items, and she asked if she could come in to collect them. I told her there were no items inside, and if anything had been left accidentally, I would place it in a sealed bag outside the building entrance with a time window for pickup. She sounded offended, as if boundaries were a personal insult, and she said I was treating them like strangers. I told her we were strangers now, because trust is not a permanent membership card, and then I ended the conversation by stepping away from the door. I expected them to keep knocking, or to argue, or to shout something dramatic through the wood, but instead I heard footsteps retreating down the hallway, slow and heavy. I waited until I heard the elevator ding, and only then did I let myself breathe fully. The whole exchange had been short, but it left residue because it confirmed what I already knew. Lila had not only lied, she had started distributing lies like insurance policies, trying to secure sympathy in advance. The engagement ring was not the only thing she brought back from that weekend. She brought back a plan. An hour later, I got a message from an unfamiliar social media account. No picture, just a string of numbers and a name that looked deliberately generic. The message was not a question, not an apology, not even an insult. It was a sentence that tried to sound casual, but it was too sharp to be casual. You should stop contacting people because you're making yourself look unstable. I stared at it for a long moment, and my first instinct was to ignore it, but my second instinct was to capture it, because anonymous messages are how cowards try to rewrite history without leaving fingerprints. I took a screenshot, saved it, and added it to my notes timeline with the date and time. Then I called Grant, not because I wanted to gossip, but because I wanted to compare what kind of pressure he was getting, and when he answered, he sounded tired in a way that made me think he had not slept either. He told me Lila had been calling him non-stop, switching between crying and rage, and he said her parents had tried to persuade him to give her space and reconsider, as if space could turn betrayal into a misunderstanding. He said he refused, and he said Lila's mother suggested I had manipulated Lila because apparently in their minds Lila could not be both responsible and guilty. I told him her parents had shown up at my door, and Grant went quiet for a moment, and then he said something that made my skin prickle. He said Lila had told him I was obsessed and that I had threatened to ruin her life. He said he did not believe it, not after hearing my voice on speaker and hearing how factual I was, but he wanted me to know what she was planting. I felt a cold anger rise in me, not the explosive kind, but the kind that sharpens your thinking and strips away hesitation. I told him I had receipts, not financial receipts, but a record of events and messages, and I told him I was not going to chase her, but I was not going to let her paint me as dangerous either. Grant said he had one more problem. He said the ring was from his grandmother, not a store purchase, and that meant it carried family meaning that made the betrayal sting deeper. He said his family was angry, and they wanted to know who I was, where I lived, and whether I planned to do something. The idea that I might be treated like a threat because I was the person Lila lied to felt surreal, but it also made sense because people under stress reach for the simplest villain. I told him I planned to do nothing except keep my distance and protect my own name, and I told him if anyone asked, he could say exactly that. After the call, I sat down at my kitchen table and opened my laptop, not to start a war, but to prepare for the possibility of one. I gathered what I had, without digging into anything illegal or invasive, just what was already mine. The moving company receipt with my name, the message thread where Lila told me she was going on a girls' weekend, the photo she posted publicly with a vague caption that now looked like a smirk, and the screenshot of the anonymous message implying I was unstable. I organized it into a simple folder with clear file names and dates, the way you would organize evidence for a landlord dispute or a workplace misunderstanding, because the structure itself becomes a defense. At around dusk, my building's intercom buzzed, and the sound startled me because it was so ordinary, the kind of sound that usually means a package or a neighbor forgetting keys. I walked to the intercom and asked who it was. A man's voice answered, polite and professional, saying he had a delivery for me that required signature. I asked which company, and he said it was from a local courier service. I told him to leave it with the front desk, but he said it was marked, hand to recipient. That phrasing made my stomach tighten, because hand to recipient is what people choose when they want certainty. I went downstairs, keeping my posture calm, and when the elevator doors opened onto the lobby, I saw a man in a courier jacket holding a flat envelope. He asked for my name, I confirmed it, and he handed me the envelope with a neutral expression, as if he had no idea what was inside. The envelope was thick, heavier than it should have been, and the return address was a post office box number. No name, no company, no warmth. I did not open it in the lobby, because I did not want to give anyone watching the satisfaction of seeing my reaction. I signed, thanked the courier, and walked back upstairs with the envelope held carefully, like it might leak something onto my hands. Inside my apartment, I placed it on the table and stared at it, the way you stare at a message you know will change the tone of your life. I used a letter opener and slid it under the seal, slow and controlled, and when I pulled the contents out, I felt a flicker of shock I did not expect. It was not a legal notice, not a threat, not a love letter. It was a printed packet of screenshots, photos, and a short typed note clipped to the front. The note was only 2 lines long, but the implication was heavy enough to make my chest feel tight. It said, in clean black font, that if I believed I was the only man Lila had been living with, then I was naive, and it said there was another person who deserved to know the truth. Under the note was a photo of Lila, taken recently, standing beside someone I did not recognize, smiling in a way that looked practiced, and on her hand, the engagement ring caught the light like a warning. I flipped through the packet, heart beating harder now, and the images grew more specific, more damning, more impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Whoever sent it had been watching her longer than I had, and they had decided I was the next person to be pulled into the blast radius. By the time I reached the last page, my hands were steady again, but my mind was no longer calm, because I understood exactly what this was. This was not just fallout. This was a second layer of the story, and it meant someone else had been documenting Lila too. And the worst part was that the packet included an address, and next to it, a name, and I recognized the street immediately, because it was the street where her parents lived. I sat at the table with the packet spread out like a map of someone else's war, and for a long minute, I did not do anything heroic or clever, because my brain was busy recalibrating to a new kind of betrayal. The address printed near the bottom of the last page was on the same street as Lila's parents, but it was not their house, and the name beside it was not hers either. It was a full name, first and last, spelled neatly, like whoever typed it wanted there to be no confusion, no wiggle room, and no chance for Lila to twist the facts later. The first impulse was anger, the kind that pushes you toward the door without shoes. But I did not move on impulse anymore, because impulse was the fuel Lila used to light rooms on fire and walk away smiling. I forced myself to breathe slowly, then I reread the 2-line note clipped to the packet, and I tried to hear the voice behind it, because notes like that always have a tone even when they are typed. It was not threatening, not pleading, and not emotional, which made it feel more dangerous than any rant would have, because it sounded like a person who had already accepted damage and decided to convert it into leverage. I flipped back through the pages and looked for patterns instead of drama. The first few screenshots were social media images, the kind anyone could pull from a public profile, but the later pages were different, and the difference mattered. There were photos taken from inside a car at dusk, grainy but clear enough to show Lila's profile in the outline of a man's shoulders, and there were screenshots of messages where the sender name had been blacked out while the date and time remained visible. Whoever made this packet had access to details that were not public, and they had chosen to share them with me, which meant I was either a tool in their plan or a partner in it. I picked up my phone and called Grant again because the fastest way to test whether I was being manipulated was to compare notes with someone else who had already been in the blast radius. He answered on the second ring, voice wary, and when I told him I had received an anonymous packet with a name and an address, he exhaled like a man who had just heard thunder after seeing the clouds. He asked whose name it was, and I told him, and there was a brief silence that told me he recognized it. Then he said that was the name Lila had mentioned once, casually, in a way that had sounded like a joke at the time, and he said she referred to him as the safe option, like the man was an appliance she could plug into her life when she got tired of improvising. Grant asked me what I planned to do, and I told him the truth, which was that I did not know yet, because every decision felt like it could be used against me. He said his family had been asking questions, and that he had refused to give them my address, and he said Lila's mother had already been hinting that I was unstable, like she was laying a foundation for a story where Lila was a victim of 2 men instead of an architect of her own lies. I told Grant I had not contacted anyone, that I was not going to show up at someone's house like a villain in a cheap thriller, and I said I only wanted to know what was real. Grant paused, and then he said something that made my stomach tighten again. He said the name in my packet was not just a random fiancé, because that man's family had money and influence in a small, petty way, the kind that controls charity boards and church committees and neighborhood narratives. Grant said Lila knew exactly what she was doing if she was tying herself to that family, and he said that if I walked into their world angry, I would be framed as the problem before I even spoke. I thanked him for the warning, ended the call, and stared at the address again, because the challenge was no longer just telling the truth. It was telling the truth in a way that could not be buried under polite denial. I did not drive there that night because darkness makes everything look like stalking, even when you have a reason, and I refused to give anyone the optics they wanted. Instead, I cleaned my apartment like a man scrubbing fingerprints off his own life, not because I had done something wrong, but because I wanted there to be nothing in my space that still belonged to Lila's chaos. I put the packet in a clear sleeve, slid it into a folder, and labeled it with the date, and then I set the folder inside a kitchen drawer because I needed to be able to find it quickly if the story turned. After that, I slept lightly, waking twice to check that the door was locked, which irritated me because fear is the last gift liars leave behind. The next morning, I took my car and drove toward Lila's parents' neighborhood, not to confront anyone, but to verify something basic, whether the address was real and whether the name existed in the world beyond a sheet of paper. The neighborhood was quiet in the way expensive neighborhoods pretend to be humble, with trimmed hedges and clean sidewalks, and neighbors who wave like they are friendly while memorizing your license plate. I parked 2 blocks away because I had no interest in being noticed, and I walked the rest of the way, hands in my coat pockets, head up, posture neutral, like a man out for a routine morning walk. When I reached the street, I recognized Lila's parents' house immediately, because it was the kind of home built to signal stability, and right now, stability was the mask hiding rot. I did not stop there, and I did not look too long, because the point was not to relive yesterday's theater. I kept walking until I reached the address from the packet, and the house there looked newer than the others, freshly painted, with a professionally landscaped front yard and a driveway wide enough to suggest a family that liked to host. There was a car parked near the curb, a silver sedan with a dealership frame still on the plate, and the detail bothered me, because it implied recent purchase, recent upgrade, and recent optimism. I stood across the street and watched for less than a minute, just long enough to confirm there were lights on inside and movement near the kitchen window. And then I turned away, because staring longer would turn verification into fixation. My goal was to learn one piece of information without creating a scene, and I had already learned it. The address was real, the house was occupied, and the packet was not a bluff. I started walking back toward my car, and halfway down the block, I heard my name. I turned and saw a man stepping out of a driveway 2 houses away, holding a travel mug, dressed in a fitted jacket that made him look like he had already had a personal trainer and a career coach before breakfast. He was tall, clean-cut, and familiar in a way that made my mind click through images until I realized why. He was the man in the photo from the packet, the one beside Lila, where the engagement ring caught the light. He looked at me with the cautious curiosity of someone who recognizes a face from a story they have heard but cannot place it yet. He walked closer, not aggressively, but with confidence that suggested he was used to being listened to. He asked if he could help me, and the phrasing was polite but territorial, like he was offering assistance while marking the boundary of his neighborhood. I told him I was looking for an address, and I let my eyes flick toward the house from the packet because I wanted to see if he reacted. His gaze followed mine, and I saw the smallest shift in his expression, the kind that happens when someone hears their own name in a stranger's mouth without actually hearing it. He asked who I was. I said my name again, calmly, and I watched his face tighten around it, because recognition arrived all at once and brought something ugly with it. He did not ask why I was there. He asked how I knew Lila. The fact that he did not ask if I knew her told me he already believed the answer, even if he did not want to. I said I knew her well enough to have lived with her, and I did not add drama to it, because facts land harder when you don't decorate them. For a second, he looked like his brain had shorted, like someone had swapped the script in his hands, and he was trying to keep reading anyway. Then he recovered, because men like him are trained to recover, trained to keep their posture intact even when their life is cracking. He said that was not possible because Lila had told him she had been staying with her parents for months while she figured out her next steps, and he said she had framed it like a sad, brave reset. I nodded once, like I was listening to a business report, and I said it was possible because her belongings had been in my closet until 2 days ago. He took a half step back, and his grip tightened on the travel mug, and I saw the first real emotion flash in his eyes, not sadness, not guilt, but humiliation. Humiliation is the emotion that makes men dangerous, not because it makes them violent, but because it makes them desperate to find someone to blame quickly. He asked if I had proof, and I did not answer immediately, because that was the moment where a private conversation could turn into a neighborhood spectacle if handled wrong. I told him I had timelines, photos of move-out receipts, and messages that matched the dates, and I told him I was not there to fight him. He asked why I was there then. I said someone had sent me a packet with his address, and I said I came to confirm whether it was real, because I did not want to accuse the wrong person. His face hardened at the mention of the packet, and he asked who sent it, and I told him I did not know. He looked past me toward the house again, and in that glance, I saw calculation. The quick mental math of a man realizing that his engagement had become a public risk. He asked me to come inside and talk privately, and the request sounded reasonable, but I did not trust reasonable anymore. I told him I would talk in a neutral place, somewhere public enough to stay civil, but private enough to avoid gossip, and I suggested the cafe on the main road where nobody cared about neighborhood reputations. He hesitated, then nodded, and he said he needed 10 minutes. I watched him walk toward his house, and when he reached the door, he paused, as if he could feel his life changing before he even crossed the threshold. He went inside, and I stood on the sidewalk with my hands in my pockets, feeling something cold and clear settle into my chest. Because the packet had not just revealed a fiancé, it had delivered me to him. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was about to watch the moment Lila's double life stopped being an idea and became a face. The cafe sat on the main road like a compromise, bright windows, neutral music, and the kind of steady foot traffic that kept everyone civil because nobody wanted to be the loud story strangers remembered. I arrived first and chose a table near the side wall, not tucked away like a conspirator, but not centered like a performer, and I ordered black coffee because sugar felt like a lie in my mouth. I watched the door without staring at it, letting my eyes rest on reflections and movements, because I had learned that waiting is a kind of test, and people always reveal something while they think they are still off stage. He walked in exactly 11 minutes later, which told me he had taken longer than he promised, but not long enough to look like he stalled, and he wore a different coat than before, heavier, more formal, as if a wardrobe change could restore control. He spotted me immediately, then scanned the room like he was checking for witnesses, and the habit irritated me because it suggested he was already rehearsing a version of the story where he was the victim of an ambush. He bought his own drink, which was smart because it prevented any petty narrative about me trying to drug him or manipulate him, and then he sat across from me with a posture that signaled confidence, even though his eyes betrayed a restless, cornered focus. We did not exchange pleasantries, because pleasantries require a shared reality, and we did not have one. He said my name again, slowly, like he was tasting it for poison, and he asked how long she had been living with me. I answered with the simplest truth, because complicated truth sounds like excuse, and I told him it had been nearly a year in my apartment, with her mail, her spare keys, her favorite mug, and her habit of leaving hairpins on every flat surface. His mouth tightened on something like disbelief, and he said she told him she had been rebuilding her life after a difficult relationship, and that her parents were supporting her while she healed. I nodded once, not to validate him, but to mark the point where his fantasy met the wall. He asked why I had moved her belongings out, and his tone carried the accusation of a man who wanted me to be the villain so he could stay the hero. I told him I did it because she left for a girls' weekend and returned with an engagement ring, and because when I asked about it she said we needed to talk, and because I realized I had been living with a person who treated commitment like a rotating door. He flinched slightly at the phrase engagement ring, like even saying it out loud made it more real, and he asked whether I had confronted her. I told him I did not chase her for an argument, because arguments give liars practice, and I told him I packed her things, scheduled movers, and had the key returned through the building office like a clean administrative decision. His fingers tapped the lid of his cup, and he asked if she knew I had done that. I said she would know the second she tried to come back, and I watched his face shift again, because he understood what that implied, and the implication was not just eviction, but replacement, because in her mind, the space she occupied in my life was supposed to be permanent until she chose to leave it. He asked me why I was telling him any of this, and the question carried something raw underneath it, because it was the first time he sounded less like a defender and more like a man trying to calculate whether he had been tricked into buying a ring for a woman who still slept in another man's bed. I slid my phone across the table, not the way you slide it when you want someone to see something, but the way you slide it when you want to establish that you are not afraid of facts. On the screen was a photo I had taken days earlier, showing Lila's neatly stacked boxes in my hallway beside a date-labeled packing list. And beside that was a screenshot of a message thread where she had asked me to leave the spare key under the mat because she was running late, a message that now read like a sick joke. He stared at the screen for a long time, and his breathing changed, shallow and controlled, like he was trying not to let the room see him lose. He pushed the phone back toward me without touching it, and he asked if that was all. I told him it was not all, and I told him I had the mover's receipt with her name, the building email confirming the key drop, and a photo of her engagement ring posted online by a friend who apparently could not resist turning private deception into public decoration. He asked me who sent the packet, and I said again that I did not know, because I did not, and because pretending to know would place me in the center of someone else's revenge. He leaned forward, and his voice lowered, and he asked if I was trying to blackmail him, and for the first time I felt actual contempt rise cleanly through my chest. I told him blackmail required desire, and I told him I did not want anything from him, because I did not want his money, his apology, or his permission to exist. I told him the only thing I wanted was to stop being a character in her story, and I told him that if he wanted a fight, he would have to fight her, not me, because she was the one who sold him a false life and installed herself in mine at the same time. He sat back, and his shoulders looked heavier, as if the facts added weight to his body, and he asked me whether she had said anything about him to me. I almost laughed, but laughter would have been cruel, and I did not want cruelty to be my new identity. I told him she had mentioned a man who came from stability, a man she described as safe, and I told him she said it the same way she described a financial plan or a winter coat, as something useful. His face hardened, not at me, but at the version of himself she had apparently confessed in passing, and he said his parents would never accept this, which was an odd thing to say, because it revealed the real pressure point. Not love, not trust, but approval. He asked me if I would send him copies of what I had, and I paused, because giving him evidence was not a small act. It was handing ammunition to someone I still did not fully understand. I told him I would not send him anything immediately, and I watched his eyes sharpen, but I continued, and I told him I would show him what I had, in person, if he agreed to 2 conditions. I told him the first condition was that he would not contact my work, my building, or anyone in my circle, and I told him the second condition was that if he confronted her, he would do it without dragging my name into it like a threat. He stared at me, weighing whether he could accept boundaries from a stranger, and then he nodded, not because he respected me, but because he needed the truth more than he needed pride. He asked me what I planned to do now. I told him I planned to move, and the admission came out colder than I expected. But it was real, because once betrayal turns public, the city shrinks, and every grocery store aisle becomes a courtroom. I told him I had a transfer lined up, and that my lease was flexible enough to end cleanly, and that I wanted a place where her story would not follow me through mutual friends and casual sightings. He asked whether I planned to disappear before she could explain herself, and the phrase explain herself sounded so innocent that it almost made me angry again. I told him she had already explained herself for months through choices, and I told him I had listened long enough. He stared at the tabletop like it might offer him instructions, and then he asked me a question that surprised me. He asked whether I thought she actually loved him. I did not answer right away, because the honest answer would have wounded him, and the kind answer would have been a lie, and I was done donating lies to anyone. I told him I thought she loved what he represented, and I told him she loved the way his future looked on paper, and I told him she loved the feeling of being wanted by more than one man at a time. His jaw clenched, and he looked away toward the window, where a couple sat laughing over pastries, careless and safe, and the sight seemed to offend him. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at it, and I knew what he was considering, because phones make cowards brave and make brave men reckless. He said he could call her right now and force the truth, and I told him that forcing the truth rarely works with someone who has rehearsed 10 versions of every sentence. I told him if he wanted the truth, he needed to ask one question that could not be answered with emotion, a question that required a date, a location, and a consistent timeline. He looked back at me, suspicious again, and he asked what question. I told him to ask her where she slept last Tuesday night, and I told him to ask her to answer without telling a story around it. He swallowed, and I saw his throat move like he was trying to push down panic, and then he said something that confirmed what I had sensed from the beginning. He said his parents were expecting them at a family dinner that evening, and he said he was supposed to announce the engagement formally in front of relatives who would clap and take photos and post them online like a victory. The idea of Lila standing in that dining room with a ring on her finger while my apartment still smelled faintly like her shampoo made something in me go quiet and precise. I told him he should not announce anything tonight, and he said if he backed out now, his mother would demand a reason. I told him then he needed a reason that was factual, not emotional, because emotional reasons can be dismissed as jealousy or fear. He asked me if I would come. The request hung between us like a spark near gasoline, because it was absurd and dangerous and also perfectly logical in his mind, because he wanted a witness who could validate reality. I told him I would not step into his family's dinner like a weapon, because I refused to let Lila turn me into the monster in their story, and I told him that if he wanted to survive this with dignity, he needed to keep it clean. He looked at me with something close to resentment, and I understood it, because resentment is what people feel when you refuse to play the role they need you to play. I stood up, because the conversation had reached the point where staying longer would create unnecessary intimacy, and intimacy was exactly what Lila used to blur boundaries. I told him I would meet him later at a neutral place, and I told him I would show him copies of the receipts and the building email, and I told him after that, what he did was his choice. He nodded, but his eyes kept flicking toward the door as if he expected Lila to walk in at any moment and wrap the room around her finger with tears and charm. I left cash on the table, not because I cared about the coffee, but because I wanted to leave nothing unfinished. Outside, the air felt sharper and my hands trembled slightly as adrenaline drained, not from fear, but from the strange shock of watching another man realize he had been living inside my life without knowing it. I walked to my car and sat for a minute without starting the engine because I needed to decide what mattered more, closure or control. My phone buzzed with a new notification, and when I looked down, I saw an unknown number had sent a message with no greeting and no signature, just a single sentence that made my stomach drop in a new way. It said very simply that Lila was on her way to my apartment right now, and that she was not coming alone. I sat in my car for a full minute, staring at that message like it could change if I looked at it long enough, and I realized that the one thing I had been counting on, the thin mercy of time, had just been taken off the table. The sender's number meant nothing to me, and the wording felt too precise to be a prank, which narrowed the options down to the kind of person who enjoyed being useful only when it caused maximum damage. I started the engine and drove back toward my building with the same calm you get when your body is tired of panic and decides it would rather be efficient. The streets blurred past in wet winter light, and all I could think about was how carefully I had moved, how quietly I had packed her life into boxes, how neatly I had made it administrative, because I wanted the ending to be boring and undeniable. Boring endings do not exist for people like Lila, because boredom is the one thing she cannot tolerate, and if she cannot have love, she will take spectacle, and if she cannot have a future, she will burn the present so nobody else can live in it comfortably. I pulled into the lot, parked crooked for once, and walked inside with my keys already in my hand, feeling every step like a decision I had already made. The lobby smelled like floor cleaner and stale heat, and the security camera above the mailboxes stared down like a bored judge, and I wondered, not for the first time, how many lives had cracked open in this exact spot while the building kept breathing like nothing happened. I glanced at the package shelf, the elevator mirror, the hallway that led to my unit, and I saw nothing that looked like Lila, which meant she was either upstairs already or she was being theatrical and waiting for me to arrive so she could time her entrance. I pressed the elevator button and watched the numbers blink, and I thought about the mover's receipt tucked in my glove compartment, and the building office email saved on my phone, and the key return log entry that made my choice feel official. When I stepped onto my floor, I heard voices before I saw anyone, and the sound was wrong for this hallway. Too loud, too tight, as if someone had dragged a family argument out of a private kitchen and into a shared corridor. Lila stood near my door, angled toward the peephole like she had been trying to look through it with willpower alone, and beside her was a man I recognized only from the curated photos she had let slip into her life like little flags. He was taller than I expected, dressed like someone who believed a jacket could count as character, and his face held the kind of controlled irritation people wear when they think they are dealing with a minor inconvenience, not a life-altering lie. Her parents were there too, which told me everything about her strategy in one glance, because she had brought witnesses who were supposed to frame her as a good daughter with good intentions, and she had brought a man who believed he was arriving to hear news, not to learn he had been a guest in someone else's relationship. Her mother clutched her purse with both hands and kept darting glances at the closed doors along the corridor, already terrified of being overheard, while her father stood rigid and silent, his jaw set like he had decided anger would keep him from looking foolish. Lila's eyes snapped to me the second I appeared, and for a fraction of a second I saw relief, not love, but relief, because I was present and therefore usable. She said my name in the tone people use when they want to pretend familiarity is a form of safety. And then she began to talk, fast, breathy, layered with urgency, telling me we needed to handle this calmly, telling me she had been trying to reach me, telling me there had been misunderstandings. I did not answer her, because answering would invite a negotiation, and I had already chosen not to negotiate with someone who treated truth like a set of interchangeable outfits. I looked at the man beside her, and I saw his eyes track over my face, measuring, comparing, looking for the villain he had been promised. He introduced himself as Graham, and he spoke with the careful firmness of someone who had never been forced to beg for clarity. He said Lila told him she had been staying here temporarily, and he said he came with her to retrieve her things, and he said he wanted this to be respectful and quick. His voice was steady, but his posture was slightly forward, as if he expected me to block the door or explode, as if he had already decided what kind of man I was based on whatever she had fed him. Lila's mother murmured something about privacy, and her father's eyes flicked to my door like he wanted to kick it open and end the suspense. I unlocked my door, opened it halfway, and stepped aside without any dramatic flourish, because I was not going to give them the satisfaction of thinking I was afraid of a hallway audience. The apartment looked stripped and clean, because it was, because I had already removed the clutter that had once made it feel like shared life, and because absence is a brutal kind of proof. There were no shoes by the entrance except mine, no coat tossed on the chair, no makeup bag on the counter, no cute little signs in the kitchen pretending the space had a personality. Lila froze for half a second, and I watched her brain adjust, because she expected to walk in and find her fingerprints everywhere, and instead, she found a room that looked like a person had never existed there. She stepped inside anyway, as if momentum could replace permission, and her mother followed with a pinched expression, and Graham hesitated for a beat before joining them, because the room did not match the story he had been carrying. Lila turned toward me and asked where her things were, and the question was loaded with outrage, as if she had been robbed instead of removed. I told her calmly that her belongings had been moved out, and I told her they were at the storage unit listed on the mover's invoice, and I told her the key she used was no longer valid because I had returned it and requested a rekey. Her father's eyes widened at the word rekey, as if he did not like the idea that consequences could be purchased with one phone call. Graham looked between us, trying to anchor himself, and he asked, with a faint edge, why I had her things packed if she had only been staying here temporarily. Lila turned her head toward him too quickly, and she said she had told him she was living with a friend while she got back on her feet, and she said she did not want to burden him with details. I watched Graham's face tighten, and I noticed he did not look at her with tenderness. He looked at her like a man searching for a seam in a costume. I told Graham that Lila had not been staying here as a guest, and I told him she had been living with me, and I said it in the same tone you used to correct a wrong address because I refused to sound emotional while telling the truth. For a moment, nobody spoke, and the silence in my living room felt heavier than furniture because it forced everyone to sit inside a reality they could not soften. Lila tried to laugh, which was a mistake, because laughter is a weapon when it is shared, but a confession when it is alone, and her laugh came out thin and brittle. She said I was being dramatic, and she said we had been complicated, and she said it was not like that. And then she began to talk about timing and stress and how she had not known how to have the conversation. Graham's eyebrows pulled together, and he asked her, slowly, why she had an engagement ring on her finger if she was still living with me. Lila's mother stepped forward and said this was inappropriate, and she asked me to lower my voice even though my voice had been steady, and I realized her mother was not reacting to volume. She was reacting to shame. Her father finally spoke, and he asked me what I wanted, because in his mind every man has a price, and he was looking for the transaction that would make this go away. I told him I wanted nothing, and I told him I had already made the only decision that mattered, and I told him this was not a negotiation. It was the consequence of her choices landing in the same room at the same time. Graham's gaze moved over the apartment again, and it was almost comical how fast his brain started picking up details now that he had permission to see them. He looked at the wall where a framed photo used to hang, leaving behind a slightly lighter rectangle of paint, and he looked at the empty hook by the door where her purse had always hung, and he looked at the kitchen counter where the imprint of a coffee machine had once been, and he looked at Lila like she had turned into a stranger right in front of him. He asked her, quietly, how long she had been living here, and Lila's mouth opened, closed, and then opened again, because she needed a number that could survive the next 5 questions. She said it had been a few months, and she said she had been planning to move out, and she said she was just waiting for the right time. I took my phone from my pocket, opened the building email, and held it out toward Graham, showing the key return confirmation with a date that did not support her timeline at all. I did not shove it at him like a threat. I simply offered it like a receipt, and that detail mattered, because receipts do not argue. They just exist. Graham read the date twice, and I watched his throat move as he swallowed something sharp, and then he asked her why she had told him she was staying with her parents on weekdays. Lila's eyes flashed toward me, full of a warning she no longer had the power to deliver, and she said he was twisting her words, and she said she had never lied. She had just not explained everything. That sentence, that lazy dodge, landed like a slap, because it was the kind of phrase liars love, broad enough to sound reasonable, empty enough to hold any shape. Graham took a step backward, as if he needed distance to think, and her mother reached for his arm with a frantic, placating gesture that made him flinch away. Her father muttered something about handling this privately, but privacy was no longer an option, because the truth was already standing in a hallway that belonged to other people too. Graham turned to me, and his voice sounded different now, stripped of politeness and full of a flat disbelief that hurt more than shouting. He asked me if I had proof, not because he wanted to fight me, but because he needed his mind to stop spinning. I told him I could show him the mover's invoice with her name, and I told him I could show him the storage unit contract, and I told him he could ask her to open her phone and scroll back through her messages, but I also told him he did not need any of that if he would just look at her reaction when questions got specific. Lila interrupted and said he did not have the right to demand her phone, and Graham stared at her like he had just heard the final nail being tapped into place. Her mother began to cry in small, embarrassed bursts, apologizing without saying what she was apologizing for, and her father's face went dark as he realized this was not a misunderstanding between men. It was his daughter's double life collapsing in front of an outsider. Lila stepped closer to Graham and tried to touch his hand, and he pulled back as if her skin carried the lie. He asked her, very calmly, whether she had been sleeping in my bed while she wore his ring. Lila's lips parted, and she started to say something, and then her eyes flicked to me again, and I saw the calculation return, because she still believed she could control the frame if she chose the right words. I did not let her have that moment, because I had spent too long watching her turn conversations into fog. I reached to the shelf by the door, picked up a small, clear sleeve I had prepared without drama, and I placed it on the table between us, containing nothing explosive, just a printed copy of the storage unit address, the mover's invoice number, and the key return confirmation, each page dated, each page boring, each page lethal to her story. Graham stared at the sleeve, then looked up at her, and the expression on his face was not rage, not even heartbreak, but something colder, the sudden understanding that he had been chosen because he was useful, not because he was loved. Lila's voice rose, and she accused me of trying to ruin her life, and she said I was jealous, and she said I was punishing her for moving on, and every word sounded like a script she had practiced in front of a mirror. Graham did not respond to the accusation, and that silence was the first truly honest thing that happened in that room. He turned toward the door, and he said he needed air, and Lila lunged after him in a panic that finally looked real, because losing a fiancé in public is one thing, but losing control of the narrative in front of her parents was the kind of humiliation she could not spin into a win. They filed out into the hallway in a clumsy cluster, Lila pleading, her mother sobbing, her father swearing under his breath, and Graham walking with stiff, decisive steps like a man trying not to collapse. I followed them to my doorway, not to chase, but to make sure the boundary stayed intact, and I watched Graham stop near the elevator and turn back one last time. His eyes met mine, and he looked like he wanted to ask me 1,000 questions, but instead he asked only one, the one that mattered most because it proved he was finally seeing the real problem. He asked me, with a quiet steadiness that felt like a verdict, whether she had ever mentioned him to me at all, or whether she had kept us in separate boxes the way she kept everything else. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again in my pocket, and when I glanced down at the screen, I saw another message from the same unknown number, short enough to make my blood go cold. It said that Lila's news was not the engagement at all, and that the real announcement would make everything that just happened look like a warm-up. The second message sat on my lock screen like a blade laid gently on a table, and the worst part was how little it said while still managing to rewrite every assumption I had made about the day. I stood in my doorway with my hand on the frame, listening to the elevator cables whine somewhere beyond the wall, and I watched Lila's mother fumble with the call button while Lila tried to keep Graham close with a voice that was suddenly soft and pleading, as if softness could undo a timeline. Graham kept his eyes forward, fixed on the metal doors like he was waiting for rescue, and Lila's father stood behind them all, tense and silent, the kind of man who did not know whether to apologize, threaten, or pretend none of it had happened. When the elevator arrived and swallowed them, the hallway went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, and I realized the neighbors were holding their breath behind their doors, probably with their ears pressed to the wood, collecting details they would turn into theories by morning. I stepped back inside, closed my door, and leaned my head against it for a moment, not because I missed her, but because the adrenaline had nowhere else to go. My apartment smelled like detergent and emptiness, and the clean counters looked like a stage that had been reset after a performance, except my heart was still acting like the show was in progress. I took my phone out and opened the message thread, because if someone went through the trouble of warning me, they either wanted to help me or they wanted to steer me into something worse, and I needed to know which kind of danger I was dealing with. The unknown number had no name, no profile photo, no history, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidence, which meant it was connected to Lila's weekend, her ring, or Graham himself. I typed a simple question, asking who they were and what they meant by real announcement. Then I stared at my own words and deleted them before sending, because questions are invitations, and I had spent all day refusing invitations from people who used them like traps. Instead, I walked into the bedroom and opened the closet where Lila's clothes used to hang, because there is something about physical absence that forces clarity, and I wanted my mind anchored to the reality that she no longer had access to this space. The empty hangers swayed slightly from when the movers had yanked them off the rod, and the sight of it made me angry in a controlled way, because it reminded me how much effort I had put into making my exit neat, lawful, and irreversible. I went to the desk by the window and pulled open the drawer where I had kept every boring piece of proof, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had learned, the hard way, that people like Lila only respect what can be shown to someone else. The mover's invoice, the storage unit contract, the building office email, the key return confirmation, and a photo I had taken of her spare key on the counter before I returned it, all sat in a clear sleeve like a quiet weapon. I slid the sleeve into my laptop bag, not because I planned to chase her, but because if the next phase was going to be official, then I needed to be ready to speak in receipts, not emotions. Then I opened my calendar and checked the time, because my mind kept circling back to that phrase, real announcement. And I could picture Lila at her parents' house, sitting on their couch with her hands clasped dramatically, waiting for them to look at her with pride and sympathy all at once. My phone buzzed again, and the unknown number finally responded, not with a name, but with another sentence that made my stomach drop in a slow, heavy way. She is telling them you were controlling and she was trapped, and she is saying she is pregnant, and she needs a clean story before she posts anything. I read it twice, then a third time, because the words had a familiarity that was terrifying, like hearing a lie you already know has worked for someone in the past. The thing about accusing someone of control is that it is vague enough to be believable and sharp enough to stick, and the thing about pregnancy is that it turns every detail into a moral performance for an audience. I stood very still, feeling the air in my apartment thicken, and then I did the only thing I had promised myself I would do from the beginning, which was to move faster than her narrative. I called the building office first, not to complain, but to confirm in writing that the locks had been changed and the key had been returned before today, and I asked them to email me the confirmation again, with the date and time visible in the header. The leasing agent sounded tired and slightly annoyed, the way people sound when they realize they are being pulled into someone else's drama, but she agreed, and within minutes, the email landed in my inbox, crisp and undeniable. I forwarded it to myself, saved it, and printed it, because digital proof is useful until someone claims it was edited, and paper has a way of ending arguments before they start. Then I called the storage unit office to verify that only my name was on the contract and that access required my identification, because the last thing I needed was Lila showing up with her parents, crying at a front desk until someone decided compassion mattered more than policy. The manager confirmed it in a neutral tone, and she added that if anyone tried to gain access, they would note it and call me, which was the first kindness I had received all day that did not come with a price. I thanked her, hung up, and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop open, because if Lila was going to accuse me publicly, then my best defense was to be boring, consistent, and documented. I started writing a timeline for myself, not as a dramatic diary, but as a simple list of dates and actions, with receipts attached, because stories collapse when time refuses to bend. I wrote the date she left for her girls' weekend, the date she came back wearing the ring, the time she texted that she needed to talk, and the time I told her no need, and I noted the date I scheduled the movers, the date I returned the key, and the moment she came back with witnesses to a door that no longer belonged to her. As I typed, I kept hearing her voice from the hallway, that panicked, performative softness, and I kept seeing Graham's face, the way it shifted from confidence to confusion, to a kind of stunned humiliation that I almost felt sorry for. Except sympathy is hard when someone steps into your life like a consumer. I did not know whether she was actually pregnant, and the truth was that it did not matter yet, because the claim alone was enough to make people choose sides, and Lila had always understood that the first person to tell the story usually won. If she posted a photo of that ring next to a caption about escaping a controlling ex, people who barely knew me would nod along and share it, because outrage is easier than nuance, and everyone loves a clean villain. I needed to make it impossible for her to paint me as the man who trapped her, because the facts said the opposite, and facts were the only allies I trusted. My phone rang while I was still typing, and when I saw Graham's name on the screen, I felt a brief surge of relief that surprised me, because it meant at least one person in this mess still cared about reality. I answered, and his voice came out strained and hoarse, the voice of someone who had been trying not to lose his mind in front of an audience. He asked me, without any greeting, how long she had been living with me, and when I gave him the honest answer, he exhaled like he had been hit in the chest. He said she was at her parents' house right now, and he said she told them the ring was a promise of stability after a difficult relationship, and he said she framed me as a man who would not let her leave, a man who monitored her, a man who scared her, and he said he did not recognize the woman who could say those things with a straight face. I told him I had moved her belongings out while she was gone precisely to avoid conflict and to avoid any scene where she could claim I had done something to her, and he went silent for a moment, as if he was replaying the hallway confrontation and realizing why my calm had been so deliberate. Then he told me the part that made my hands go cold on the phone. He said she told him she was pregnant, and she said she did not know how to tell him before, and she said the baby was his because they had been trying, and she said the timing was complicated because of stress, and she said she needed him to stand by her, because I was the kind of man who would try to ruin her once I realized she was truly moving on. Graham's voice cracked on that last sentence, not with tears, but with rage, because he realized she was using him as a shield, and he realized the shield had been built out of lies. I told him I could not confirm or deny anything about her pregnancy, because I did not have access to her body or her test, and because the only thing I could responsibly do was deal in what I could prove. I told him I had documentation showing she was living with me, documentation showing I removed her belongings lawfully, and documentation showing she no longer had a key before today, and I told him that if she tried to claim I trapped her, the dates would make her story impossible. Graham asked me to send him copies of everything, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because I wanted to protect Lila, but because I did not trust any of this to stay private once it left my hands. Still, I remembered his face in the hallway, that stunned, hollow look of a man realizing his life had been built on someone else's fiction, and I made a choice I rarely make with strangers, which was to assume he wanted the truth more than he wanted leverage. I told him I would email him the receipts and the timeline, and I told him to keep his communication with her in writing, and I told him that if she tried to drag me into a public fight, he should not defend me with opinions. He should defend himself with questions that demanded dates. He asked me what questions, and I said he should ask her when she moved in with me, and he should ask her why she kept the lease and the mail and the shared utilities out of his story, and he should ask her why she brought him to my building if she was afraid of me, because fear does not stage scenes, fear avoids them. After I hung up, I sat at the table and stared at my own hands, because the situation had shifted from humiliating to dangerous, not in a physical sense, but in the way reputations and relationships can be murdered without a weapon. I opened my email, attached the building confirmation, the mover's invoice, and the storage contract, and I sent them to Graham with a short note that contained no anger and no insults, only dates, addresses, and facts. Then I opened my social media accounts and checked my privacy settings, not because I planned to hide, but because I refused to let her tag me into a public narrative that I would be forced to fight in comment sections like a fool. Another message from the unknown number arrived just as I finished, and this time it was longer, as if the sender had decided subtlety was no longer helpful. She is going to post tonight, and she is going to say you threw her out because she is pregnant, and she already told her parents you might show up and cause a scene, so if you go there, you become her proof. I read it. Then I set my phone down, and I felt something settle inside me, something cold and certain, because the trap was suddenly obvious. If I showed up at her parents' house even calmly, she would film it, edit it, and frame it as intimidation, and then she would have the exact evidence her audience needed, not evidence of what happened, but evidence of how it felt. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the parking lot where my car sat, small and ordinary, and I realized the next move was not confrontation, it was absence. I took my laptop bag, checked that the clear sleeve was inside, and started packing only what I needed for the next 48 hours, not because I was running from her, but because I was refusing to be present for the performance she wanted to stage. I booked a cheap hotel across town under my own name, and I emailed my boss asking for a remote day tomorrow with no explanation, because explanations become hooks for gossip. Before I left, I wrote myself one final note on paper and signed it, the same way you sign the back of a printed screenshot, because signatures do not stop lies, but they make you look like someone who expected the truth to matter. When I walked out of my apartment and locked the door behind me, I heard a neighbor's TV through the wall, some bright sitcom laughter bleeding into the hallway, and it struck me as absurd that the world could still sound normal while my life was being rewritten without my permission. The elevator took its time, and when the doors finally opened, I stepped inside and watched my reflection in the metal panel, and I wondered what Lila would post tonight, and how many people would believe her without ever asking for a date. My phone buzzed one last time as I reached the lobby, and when I glanced down, I saw a notification from a social media app I barely used, the kind of app Lila loved because it rewarded stories, not facts. Lila had just uploaded a photo, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the edge of my front door and the number on it, like a target she had decided to paint in public. My phone kept buzzing as I crossed the lobby, and I did not need to open the app to know what she had done, because Lila always believed the fastest win was dragging strangers into the fight. I stepped into the cold, started my car, and drove in silence. At the hotel, I did not rant, beg, or threaten. I built a record. I saved the screenshot showing my door number, captured the timestamp, grabbed the link while it was live, then emailed it to myself and printed it, because paper does not vanish when she edits her story. I called the leasing office and asked for an email confirming my unit number, my move-out date, and the lock change request, because I wanted one neutral voice in writing. Graham texted me close to midnight. He said Lila's parents saw the post, her mother blamed me on sight, and her father called me unstable while Lila cried and kept flashing the ring like it proved something. Graham wrote that he asked where she had been living, how long, and why she brought him to my building if she was supposedly afraid, and she changed stories twice in the same minute. He called later, and I could hear doors closing and voices lifting behind him. He said Lila admitted she had been living with me until the weekend, but she framed it as temporary. When her father asked why she never told Graham, she blamed work stress and my controlling behavior. Then she slipped and said she needed time to transition, which meant 2 lives at once. Graham said he asked to see a lease or mail, and she had nothing. I kept my voice steady and sent him what I had. I forwarded one PDF, the lease confirmation, the lock change email, the mover's invoice, and the screenshot of her post, and I told him to request everything in writing before he offered her a single promise. I told him I would not contact her, I would not show up at her parents' house, and I would not debate her narrative in public, because I was leaving the city and I wanted the record to speak. By morning her post was gone, but my folder was not. I forwarded the packet to my landlord, packed the last of my essentials, and checked out. Near noon, Graham sent one final message. He asked for the ring back. She refused until he laid my documents on the table, and her face changed when she realized the proof lived outside her control. He wrote that she screamed I planned everything, and her father asked one quiet question that ended the room. Why would an innocent person need so many stories? I locked my phone, started the engine, and crossed the city line with my evidence in the passenger seat, because I did not need revenge that looked like chaos. I needed an ending that looked like truth.